Hey, everybody, welcome to New York State Manufacturing Now, the podcast that's powered by FuseHub. I'm your host, Steve Melito. Today, we're talking to Michael Allen, the president and co-owner of Z-Axis in Phelps, New York. Z-Axis provides electronic design and manufacturing all under one roof, a rare combination. Michael has been on the podcast before to talk about Z-Axis, but he's here today to tell us about a business unit of Z-Axis called Bear Power Supplies. Michael, welcome to New York State Manufacturing Now.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and before we begin, we're going to talk about Bear, but I've got to talk about birds for just a moment. I've got some chickens here in my home office, and so for our listeners, if you hear some bird noises, that's not an error on your end. It's just where things are at today. But Michael, tell us the story of Bear. First of all, I've always loved the name. I've never seen any bears in the woods, though, working on electronics. But why did you start Bear? When did you do it? How does this business division fit into the big picture of what Z-Axis would like to achieve?
Well, 25 years ago, Z-Axis was sort of in decline in its original business, and we decided to get into power supplies. And the idea was we had a lot of experience in power supplies, so why not, go into the power supply business? And so we literally created Bear Power Supplies. It's myself and a bunch of other people sat around the room and said, we need a name. Z-Axis isn't a good name for power supply. There's no cpicture. So, we came up with the name of Bear Power Supplies. I had some very fundamental rules that had to have beginning of the alphabet, first 4 or 5 letters preferably, and had to have a picture. And it's worked out well. The number one Google search that finds Bear Power Supplies is literally Bear Power Supplies. They recognize our logo. And my wife drew the logo. It's a black bear, and that's what's indigenous in our area in upstate New York. And so that's how we started.
And it's great, and it's a lot more creative than A1 and some of these other things I see people do to try to get to the top of the heap. So some of our listeners know what a power supply is, but other folks, like myself, couldn't exactly sit down and design one. What is a power supply, Michael, and how does it work?
So power supplies range is enormous, but the classic power supply people think about is your computer may need 5 volts or 12 volts or 3.3 volts to run, but what's coming out of the wall is 120 volts AC, or in Europe 240 volts AC. And so what you have to do is get from that high voltage AC down to a low voltage for your electronic circuitry to run. And so the power supply is a device that does that.
I see. So if you have an incorrect power supply, I'm thinking that could be a pretty bad thing?
Wrong voltage power supply could be a really bad thing. Absolutely.
Okay, good. So a few months ago, you wrote an article for Electronic Design called "What is a Rugged Power Supply?" And I'll share that link in the show notes later. But for our listeners today, what makes a power supply rugged?
Well, it can mean a lot of things. Some of our rugged power supplies, have to work over a wide temperature range. We've done power supplies that have to work on the tundra, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius. Sometimes they have to be able to withstand a lot of vibration. Certainly, the classic worst case one is one on a helicopter. That constant thumping can shake parts loose. So a lot of our power supplies are encapsulated so that if you drop them on the floor, they don't get hurt. So they're filled with epoxy to make them rugged. So I've given you temperature. I've given you, mechanical ruggedness. Another reason that they may be rugged is if they're, out on a pole powering a security camera, that pole might get hit by lightning. So having a degree of protection against lightning would certainly add ruggedness. So That's some of the different ways that power supplies can be rugged.
Is EMI shielding part of what makes something rugged, or is that just standard?
No, that's pretty standard. EMI shielding or EMI filters on systems aren't really part of rugged. It's just to meet the FCC requirements so that you're not jamming people's radios, et cetera.
Right. And are there special cooling issues with power supplies? I was on a call yesterday with a manufacturer. They were telling me about making louvers to help cooling on power supplies, and I hadn't really thought about that. But do the power supplies you make have ways for air to flow?
Yeah, every power supply is not 100% efficient. So if you are producing a power supply that's putting out 750 watts, it may be bringing in 800 watts. And that other 50 watts has to be dissipated as heat. That's where it goes. And so you got to get rid of a net 750 watt power supply. You got to get rid of 50 watts of heat. And there are multiple ways of doing that. The cheapest and classic way is put a fan on it. And that's why everybody's PC has a fan. It's the cheapest and fastest way to get rid of the heat is you just blow some cool air across the circuitry and you can get rid of that heat. Does not make it rugged though. Fans fail. They suck in dirt, and so a lot of our power supplies, even up to we're doing one that's 13 kilowatts, has no fan. So you have to be very careful with your cooling. Lots of big heat sinks, lots of chimney type effects to encourage just convection to take air across it. But there are all sorts of different ways of cooling. We even make some power supplies that are submerged, so they're underwater. The ocean is a great coolant.
Sure.
Water is a very good coolant.
Right. So you've mentioned some cases where I can see that you'd need a custom power supply, but they seem extreme. Are there lots of times when somebody needs a custom power supply? And the reason I'm asking this is there are lots of places to buy a standard power supply, including online, but Bear Strength seems to be really custom power supplies.
Virtually 99% of the power supplies we produce are custom. For your average application, 99.9% of the time, you can use a standard power supply. Every PC has a standard power supply in it. It's a commodity item that's, made offshore. A lot of times people can just use standard power supplies, but there's a lot of times that you can't. There is nothing available off the shelf that'll meet your requirements. We have people's requirements that, I must be able to drop this power supply. It's used on a medical device, and it may get dropped on the floor. And if it does, I want to keep my patient alive. So may be a requirement that it can be dropped on the floor 400 or 500 times and still work. Well, there isn't a single off-the-shelf power supply that can do that. So that's an example of why you might want a custom power supply. We're sort of a leader in the industry on low leakage power supplies. That's something that's pretty much only important for medical. And, the closer you get to somebody's heart, the lower the leakage current is allowed. If the power supply is across the room from the patient, then, you can have pretty high leakage. And if it's in their vicinity where they can touch it, you have to have lower leakage. And if as soon as it gets internal, part of the circuitry gets internal to their body, then your leakage current must be much smaller so that you don't cause harm to the patient. So we make a lot of instruments that are powering infusion pumps, and, salt water is conductive, so that's inside the body. Where low leakage is important, we also make power supplies that will power cameras that are used during surgery and by definition are internal to the patient. So again, low leakage is important. And we make power supplies for different heart instruments where the instrument itself may be inside the body. And, we have to have, low leakage power supplies for that. So we really are a leader in low leakage power supplies, and there are very few CF low leakage power supplies available in the market. They just don't exist. It's pretty much forced into custom.
So I'm glad you mentioned medical power supplies. I wanted to ask about that. When you work with designers, and you mentioned low leakage current, what are some other things designers need to consider with a medical power supply? Things like proximity to the patient, I think you mentioned as well. Is there anything besides low leakage current that really is critical?
Yeah, there are some requirements that if you're, connected to a patient, not only do you have to have low leakage so you don't cause their heart to defibrillate, but if for some reason in the middle of a procedure they start having where they need to be hit with the paddles, you have to have very low capacitance to your power supply back to earth. And the reason for that is when they hit with the paddles, they want the current just to go between those paddles. They don't want you to start, kicking the surgeon or something because you got some current going through the knee. So capacitance is very important, and it's really a system capacitance. So it's not just the power supply capacitance; it's the capacitance of the power supply plus the capacitance of the device, the instrument that my customer is producing. So we work together to decide, a capacitance budget. How much can he have, and how much can I have? And that's very critical. And sometimes our power supplies have to have very low capacitance. I mean, we have one power supply for medical application that has to be less than 5 picofarads of capacitance between the input and the output, which is extremely low.
Sure. So Bear's known for its expertise in medical power supplies, certainly as a custom power supply manufacturer. Are there other markets that Bear is really looking at? I know industrial is a focus, but are there more specific parts of that industrial marketplace perhaps?
Yeah, there's a lot of industrial applications that a custom power supply might be needed. examples are anything used in the railroad industry. There are circuitries in the railroad industry that are literally still working, relay circuits that have been in service for over 100 years. And so, normal power supplies will have a practical life of between 5 and 10 years. Well, that's completely unacceptable if you're monitoring train traffic or control or those type of things. So for those type of things, you have to use a different type of power supply or components in power supply that are much more rugged, have a much longer life. And, that's not available as an off-the-shelf power supply. So certainly anything in the transportation industry often requires a custom power supply. And we have a lot of expertise in that.
Sure. How about the aerospace industry? Is that also an area that you're looking at?
It is. Most of the time that's done by very large companies. So it's not usually the type of thing that they're looking for smaller companies to produce. They're going to use thousands of them, and it's a derivation on the theme of what they've already had. And, frankly, I'd rather never make the news that there's smoke on a plane and it was caused by a fault in our power supply. So I don't go after commercial aviation at all, or military aviation. We don't design power supplies for either of those applications.
Got it. Let's talk about Bear Power Supplies as a business unit a little bit. So when you get an order for Bear Power Supplies, does that customer get access to all of the expertise within Z-Axis? And you've made a lot of equipment investments. You've got a lot of engineering talent. How does that work?
Yeah, so my engineering department and the whole company is really completely integrated between Z-Axis and Bear. So when you order a Bear Power Supply, it is being manufactured on the same equipment, the same one of my 3 surface mount lines that are placing all the parts for Z-Axis contract manufacturing. And because we do, 2/3 of the business is contract manufacturing, 1/3 is custom power supplies, we get the luxury in the power supply business to have high volume equipment that you wouldn't be able to justify for the size of Bear. And so, we get to use high volume, fast equipment to produce our power supplies, all done right here in upstate New York.
That's right. And we've talked about this before, but I believe you're one of the largest users of Micronic equipment on the East Coast. And Micronic is a PCB equipment manufacturer.
Yes, we have a total of 11 pieces of equipment from Micronics with 2 more on order. We have their stencil printers, we have 6 of their pick and place machines, and we have 4 of their storage towers.
Wow.
And certainly, there may be some people out there that have more equipment, but our pick and place machines are either the latest generation that were introduced a year ago or the second to last generation that was issued before that. So it's very modern equipment.
And all this happening in upstate New York. You're not too far from Rochester out in Phelps.
Yep, halfway between Rochester and Syracuse.
Okay, good. And how many employees do you have?
About 95 today.
About 95 today. I have a feeling you'll be hitting that 100 mark sometime.
I have a goal to keep below 100. It works well for our facility. We work with 1 shift by design. Every time we can't keep up with 1 shift, then we buy more equipment so we can. That's how we got the 6 pick and place machines. And, 1 shift doesn't have the headaches of night supervisors and trying to hire engineering, and it's the other shift's fault. And by having only 1 shift, that solves a lot of problems and makes it a great place to work. So
Absolutely.
With 1 shift, 95 people, we have a 32,000 square foot building, and 95 people work well in that. The bathrooms work well, the parking lot works well, the microwaves work well. So it's a good sizing. So if we start getting approaching 100, I will, probably figure out if there's some low value products that, we can outsource so that I can keep us at this level.
Right. And when we talked previously on a podcast, we had discussed how Z-Axis works with everyone from startups to very large manufacturers. Is that true on the Bear Power Supply side as well?
Yeah, we certainly deal with some companies that are just coming out with their first product on the Bear Power Supply, and to very large companies. We have 7 or 8 different companies that we sell a custom power supply to that sell over $1 billion a year. So, we have a lot of large companies that are our customers.
Excellent. So last question for you, Michael. If somebody wants to get in touch with you about Bear Power Supplies, what's the best way for them to do that?
We have a contact form on our website that we really do take care of. It's not like one of these ones we check it once a week. And certainly people can always reach out to me or my sales department, sales at Bear, BEARPWR.com. It would certainly get back to people very quickly.
Fantastic. Michael Allen, thank you so much for being on New York State Manufacturing Now.
Thank you.
So we've been talking to Michael Allen of Z-Axis and Bear Power Supplies in Phelps, New York. And if you'd like to hear more from Michael, I hope you'll consider joining FuseHub for How Manufacturers Succeed at Marketing, an upcoming virtual event that's scheduled for May 14th from 12 to 1 p.m. Michael will be one of our panelists, and one of the things you'll learn is how Z-Axis built a YouTube channel with over 100 videos and 6,000 subscribers. That's right, 6,000 subscribers. To join us for this, you'll need to register. So go right now to fusehub.com/infuse-marketing-meetups. And if you didn't get that URL, don't worry. Just email FuseHub at info@fusehub.com and we'll get you set up. So on behalf of FuseHub and New York State Manufacturing Now, this is Steve Melito signing off.